Welcome to the Mile High Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Daniel Knowles, and I am so thrilled to have you listening or watching in whatever way you're listening or watching, and want to encourage you to always be able to access Mile High Tick and never miss Mile High Tick by hitting subscribe on whatever channel you are listening or watching this, whether it be Google or Stitcher or iTunes and so on. And also, I am overjoyed and thrilled to be in discussion today with one of my favorite people in chiropractic, Dr. David Fletcher, who is the president of Chiropractic Leadership Alliance and is just a phenomenal doctor of chiropractic. And we are huge fans of all the work that he's done through CLA and through chiropractic overall to help people focus their assessments, to focus their outcomes in serving people through clearing the nerve system and assessing the nerve system. And he's going to be speaking at Mile High this year, which, as people are just finding out, is going to be the last weekend in September 24th. So we look forward to seeing him there. Dr. David, thank you for joining us today.
Danny, honestly, it's it's so much fun. If they only could have heard what we were talking about before the hit record button was going on. But you and I and your family and our families and all our collaborations that have happened over the years have brought us so closely together. But I think that the one thing that really is it's not even a common thread. It's more like we're knitted in this principle, is that it's just so easy to converse with you and the extension of you, which is Mile High, because our values are absolute, meaning that there's no difficulty in this process. And I think that's one of the reasons that not only on a personal and a professional basis, but even on this business-based model, is that what I stand for, both in CLA and what you stand for in your world, they're just like a glove in a hand. So it's a great joy for me to be on a call with you.
Well, I'm grateful to work on so many things in chiropractic together and really encourage people to assess the nerve system. So let's dive into that area, because as you and I discussed when we were putting together Mile High this year, and we've been on many podcasts together, and we've done things in your Thrill 30 program for CLA. We were talking about that this year we're focusing on the art. And when I talked to you about it and I said, was that something you'd like to do? You gave such a brilliant answer right away, which was that you said, hey, the art of the assessment. So let's talk a little bit about the art of the assessment today, because I think that's something that's sadly missing from chiropractic education a lot, and missing a lot from many chiropractic practices. Why is the assessment important?
Well, I think that if we take a look at the history of chiropractic, and I mean the more modern history of it, there's this massive bait and switch that's going on. Even if you are coming from a very principled school and otherwise, and I sit and teach and work in the curriculums and everything else, there's this sense that, well, we'll get to it. Meaning that we're still going to teach you how to palpate a spine and to assess a global range of motion and look at orthoneuro. And those are indeed signs of a system that's struggling through a subluxated state, but they don't necessarily talk to whether the person is moving towards thrival or stuck in survival mode, or even where the subluxation exists. And so there's been this massive loss of certainty with doctors that are in there of having to, almost with conjecture, almost deductive reasoning, make up, well, I guess that since you aren't clear in my other parameters, which could be very active, then the nervous system is functioning less than it should. And I always said, well, wait a minute, why don't we begin with what matters and work our way back the other way? Why don't we begin with looking at the functioning nervous system, look at the principle of coherence as a starting point, which is really chiropractic through and through, and then look at the subsets of being incoherent. And the subset of being incoherent goes from everything from regulatory, as in organ-based functionality, to structural-based incoherence, to posture, to everything. But it begins and ends with the control mechanisms and the coherence within the nervous system. So that's been the art of my assessment, concept, is let's begin with where it really matters.
Yeah, so important. And outcome assessments.
Oh, yeah.
Tom Gilardi, Sherman College, one of the things that he brought to the profession, I think, him and Reggie talked about objectives, right? That your profession's defined by your objective. And he would talk about, we don't want to have a medical or allopathic objective in
Yeah.
treating disease, okay? And your objective is locate, analyze, and correct vertebral subluxation. That's right. However, there's something that Donnie, my dad, has often said in programs. You may have heard him say this. I know a lot of people have. He says your practice, your actual practice, is going to be defined by your outcome assessments. So
Yes.
sometimes people may say, my objective is to LACVS, but the outcome assessments don't match with that and they don't realize that. Can you speak to that at all?
Oh my goodness. I think that that has been, when Donnie said that, and I listened to it years and years and years ago, but that was almost like a wake up point for myself, because I was taught, there's this great from Ram Dass. He says this very simply. He says, you can't get wet from the word water. You can talk a lot about what it feels like to be wet, but you gotta be baptized, meaning you gotta get wet. And this is particularly relevant in exams, because and outcome assessments and outcome objectives aren't necessarily what you're measuring. And so we can sit down with the big picture and talk about the value of checking for subluxation, but the question is, are you delivering that? And it's not whether or not you're delivering the adjustment, is the patient accepting that change? And we have to be in this collaborative relationship, in honesty at least. We can't change what we can't change. We can deliver adjustments, we can do it, but we need to have an honest point of view with the patient that says, despite my best efforts, you're still stuck. Despite leaving here well adjusted, you're coming back subluxated. And we need to have a way in which we can have a relevancy to that that's non-toxic. Look, I've always used X-ray in my practice, so this isn't about whether to use it or not, but you have to have a dynamic measuring stick that says, I want to look at the functionality of the nervous system as I move you from being subluxated to adjusted to remaining well adjusted. And
Right.
that's where I listened to that. And I was introduced to the insight technologies as you were in the earliest of times, and
Right.
that was the time it was referred to, and still to this day it's referred to as the subluxation station. In other words, the objective assessments were associated with using physical parameters, physiological parameters, but then looking at those through the lens of a chiropractic clinician. And let me give you an example of that. I have a background in and a fellowship in sports sciences. So if I was to use that lens of sports sciences and use something like surface electromyography, I might be interested in the firing pattern of quadratus lumborum, or I might be interested in whether there was an association between pain or dysfunction associated with that instrumentation. But through the lens of a chiropractor who's looking at the global impact of a subluxation, I can look at an EMG study and kind of go, oh, wait a minute. This is an intelligent system trying its best to reorganize itself with the energetics that it has, and it's struggling here. It's fighting itself there. It's dyspnetic, meaning it's wasting energy overall. And I need to use that not to define a diagnosis of a lesion called the subluxation, but to look at the person who is subluxated and say, are they stuck or are they moving to a better place in coherence? And that's how I love instrumentation, is that it builds everything into the story of where are we taking them.
Yes. And hey, I have to say, when I first got introduced, because you mentioned it to the Insight way back in the day, and one of the oldest models, I was saying I was never going to need any of this because I can, tell everything with my hands. That was my thought process, back, first just out of school and last year of school. And then I got introduced and I was like, well, why would you need any of this? I have to tell you, my experience now is I've seen so frequently that someone is getting supposedly outstanding chiropractic care,
Yes.
from someone who's very well reputed, and then we check their nerve system and the readings don't match with the person's uh, amount of care that they've had.
Yeah.
And I've seen that with my own care too, that because
Mhm.
I see, well, they're not changing, there's something that I'm missing. So I want to see that there's an outcome, that I'm actually delivering what I'm saying I'm delivering. And if not, I have to change my approach. And that's what I so often see missing in so many ways. And I'm not saying that because it has to be an EMG unit or insight, but that something is being used to actually outcome assess that you're delivering what you say you are delivering. And so that if you're not, you can up your game in some way. So when those don't match, like they're using some kind of outcome assessment that doesn't actually tell you about subluxation, um, per se, how do we help people realize that they need to make a shift in that?
Well, I think that you started that conversation very well because, and we'll kind of use a play on words, but these digital examination tools, which are these guys right here, have transformed in 2021 to a much finer way in which we can calibrate. These are incredible digital examination instruments right here, but there is a different way in which we can calibrate that. And so we need people to start to recognize that it isn't about giving up or substituting, it's about augmenting what we
I
know to
like
be
that.
true. My instruments, if I can call it CLA, my instruments don't feel what you feel. That
Right.
you have to have the human touch, and so this is a way in which we blend the best of chiropractic, which is our heart and our hands,
Mhm.
with instrumentation that was designed specifically for it. And so, I introduced the principle of the heart, but what has happened is that when we first introduced ourselves to the subluxation station, there was sort of this modeling that was based upon structure and function from the spine out. And there was a lot of inference that was associated, for instance, with thermal scanning, that there was an outcome associated with end organ and things of that nature. And that's still true. But in the evolution, especially at about 2006 onwards, we started to recognize that there was this growing body of knowledge. Again, I was from the sports sciences, and I had been aware of this coming out of the Russian sports federations, of something called heart rate variability. And it was emerging. And here was the thing that happened, Danny, is that you can if I ask you to use these digital sensors and I ask you to palpate your carotid artery, you're going to get a degree of interbeat interval checks, which would be associated with one beat per second, so 60 beats per minute, and that would be interesting, but it wouldn't be clinically relevant, especially if we wanted to deduce that. So we need instrumentation that's going to take it down to the third decimal point to start to see what those interbeat intervals look like. So that's what we do with our technologies now. Why do you want to know that? Well, we use that term coherence early on, but if you want to move from being a structural based subluxationist, I'll say, to where you want to move beyond function and you want to move to potential, and you want to start talk about really whether you're maintaining an optimized state, then you need to be able to look deeper into the functioning nervous system than anything surface. You need to understand to the third decimal point what the fractals of timing are, so that we can begin to look at not simply the subluxation presence, but listen to this, adaptability. We need to understand whether that person is in a raging form of adaptability called being well adjusted, or whether they are stuck and not adapting.
Right.
And so I really believe that what we offer people now in this sort of evolution of technology in this outcome assessments is that we have transformed the chiropractic experience from, and I don't ever want to minimize this, so please don't take this as a minimization, but an acceleration of from the subluxation station to the adaptation station.
Mhm.
I think that when we wrap our heads around the power that chiropractic has to shift people, not only in their perspective, but in their lifelong quest to be adaptive, both creatively, physically, emotionally, mentally, heart rate variability plays a huge role in knowing where you are on that path.
Yes, yes. And interesting that you talked about heart rate variability. Let's talk about that a little bit more,
Sure.
especially since we're in the time of COVID, right? In
Yes.
2020 and 2021. We in Colorado were instructed to close our office.
Mm-hmm.
For 6 weeks, we closed our office. And of course, when we reopened, I did something, which was I reassessed everybody who had not had care for X amount of time. A lot of them had missed their re-exams, or I want to see how their nerve system was doing. So this was an unofficial study, right? Non-published, but just a clinical experience in my own office. Whoa, the changes in people's nerve systems when they came back, and we did the neuropulse
Yeah.
on people, were tremendous. The amount of shift to sympathetic defense, fight or flight, was just people that had been living in that green area, in our care, and the amount that shifted from some were 2 months, some were 3 months before they came back, some were longer, across the board, was phenomenal and very reaffirming to how powerful what it is that we do as chiropractors. I'm sure that you've been looking at people's scans across the board, neuropulse, the EMG, the thermography. What have you seen through this time?
Similar to you, but we do it on sort of the grander scale. I mean, when I say we do it grander, one of the things that I did in 2015 was that I morphed everything that was being collected in beautiful offices like yours and every other, Insight CLA office. But we then started to collaborate all that data and bring it into the cloud. And so what happens right now, Danny, and I think you know this, and I just want our listeners to know it, is that CLA holds on to the largest tranche of subluxation-centered, wellness-centered data that has ever been collected associated with chiropractic at this moment. And I'm not sure that people understand the scope of the data that we're collecting, but now, I'm not talking about individual scans. I'm talking about exams, which could, in your case, be like an EMG, a thermal, and an HRV all at the same time. People may not realize this, but we're collecting somewhere between 50 and 60,000 of those scans each week. Okay, so we're talking about 3 million, 4 million, 5 million being exam data points that are coming in here.
Right.
So we can take a look and sort of say, oh, on March 8th of last year, which, by the way, I was in Colorado on March 8th last year doing a total solution, and I caught the last plane out of Denver, and I'm sad to say I'm still in Toronto. But the reality, it's like, oh God, it's got to end soon. But we can literally, in our data sets, take a look at what was going on in the human condition, and it is exactly what you said. Whether it is in Colorado, Toronto, in UK or otherwise, we see this. And what people have to understand is that from, again, that chiropractic lens, we're not looking for the pathology. A cardiologist using HRV has a different perspective than a chiropractor. What we're looking at, though, is this principle of incoherence. And another way of describing incoherence through the chiropractic lexicon is very simply what BJ used to talk about and Stevenson used to talk about: ease, dishyphenated ease, disease. Mm-hmm. What we're talking about is this drift from being at ease, even if they are well adjusted, to where the world pushed them to dishyphenated ease. They're incoherent. And as a result of that, sympathetic cues, you don't get to be in sympathetic overdrive unless you have lost your parasympathetic modulator, meaning you have to blunt the parasympathetic outputs. And I just want to remind people this. It's not happenstance that the great, structural technologies of adjusting, we're talking about the art of the adjustment, have stood the test of time because they addressed input, especially associated with parasympathetic regionality of the spine and the nervous system. Upper cervical, sacral occipital techniques, dual contacts when you're doing network. The reaction and the relatability is that there is a regionality as to how our nervous system promotes input from both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And what's fascinating is that when you start to combine heart rate variability with EMG and looking at the end outcome of thermography, and you start to see this regionality, we start to recognize not only globally of how these people are shifting, but where we can refine our inputs to get the biggest output that we're looking at. And it's no surprise that the non-physical adjustive techniques are, adverse mechanical cord tension is a reality in any form of subluxation. But when you take a look at HRV and combine it with EMG and combine it with that thermography modeling, you can start to see, adverse mechanical cord tension and tonal discord and structural reactivity and now neural outputs all shifting when you adjust them. It's
Right.
phenomenal.
Right. And it was also phenomenal to see through this time how people that had had care
Oh,
for
yeah.
months or years bounced back like incredibly well. And we would see that people that adapted to the stresses of the pandemic, because some people are in denial that, oh, it hasn't affected me, but we know that everybody's in this field of fear that they're all living in, that's around them, whether they know it or not. That their nerve system's being affected by just by watching the news, right? But to see them bounce back so incredibly has been so, again, reaffirming that someone who had had chiropractic care for months, for years, that their nerve system healed, responded from the distress they had been under much more effortlessly than other people.
Well, let me share that with you because I think you touched on what I think is one of the greatest outcomes that we are looking at, and it isn't even the progression; it's the ability to stay well adjusted, this
Yeah.
resiliency. And I think that when you take a look at some of the work that catches my attention the most in our research modeling and otherwise, it isn't even so much that chiropractic influences the nervous system. I hope we're way past that. But the truth of it is that it doesn't just influence the nervous system like kicking you in the shin and making you feel better if you don't have that. The realities is that it sets a new tonality within the nervous system, which is referred to as neuroplasticity. And so once we start to engage adaptability and once we start to put our lens of our outcomes and our assessment models associated with it, you start to get this idea that people who are well adjusted stay well adjusted, this canalization of pathways. Here's some of the coolest things that I want to share with you guys on this call is that we use a mechanism of combining some algorithms we created that we're very proud of for both scoring algorithms and otherwise to take the data from those three different data sets, which are HRV, EMG, and thermography, and combine them so that there's a referenceable point. And that point would be something called a core score. So it's a nice indices that allows us to confer with a patient that they're tracking in the right direction. But more importantly, and this is what is fascinating, is there appears to be, and again, this is where the data sets and AI is going to come in when we go to analyze all of this data. There appears to be a phenomenon that we are watching, is that once that core score seems to approach and or eclipse 80, which means that there's coherence that's sitting in about the 80% efficiency range of these different models of assessment, that they don't drop off. In other words, that they don't waver down unless there's been a trauma or whatever else. There seems to be this difficulty, like any other healing protocol, of getting people up to about a threshold. But this resiliency threshold under a chiropractic lens seems to be measurable and seems to be identifiable. And I would posit that in my lifetime and your lifetime, Danny, with this data that we've collected, and we put it in front of some data scientists, like the people that you've grown up with, in the NSA community and all the rest of it. But we put the data in front of these data scientists that they're going to be able to take a look at that and go, wow, look at this trend that occurs in populations that have been, needing adjustments, well adjusted, maintaining their well adjusted state. Oh, even in a pandemic, if they get a kick in the arse to go there, their resiliency brings them back up above. Wouldn't the world want that?
Right. Exactly. And this is also a very interesting time to be a chiropractor, because with COVID, yes, there are negatives. However, in taking care of people during this time, it's made the conversation about health shift. And I've noticed in my own practice how people have had a different tone of acceptance relative to what we've communicated. Like that there's a shift of awareness of health beyond just symptoms being gone, because there's all kinds of people that are COVID positive and don't necessarily express symptoms, right?
Right.
Not a surprise to you and I. And that people are really, there's a shift that's being um, put out through all of this, of that health is you being in a state that's more resilient and more adaptable, and that people that were already healthier have a greater rate of recovery, and such, which is a great thing for us to be able to share, because what we shared all along, is that adaptability, that in the face of distress or increased stresses, that we can dance with that, and that our body can be able to be to not get out of adjustment and not to get into a stuck state, and that we can maintain a dynamic state.
Let me address this adaptability on a really practical basis for our listeners and the rest of it. And you said it right there. I think that this is also an intersectional moment for chiropractic practice. Is that I think that those people who had not embraced this model of adaptive capacity, resiliency, and neurofunctionality are struggling right now. I
Yes.
think that their ability, when everything got cut off, when traffic got cut off, when back pain got cut off, people aren't living the lives that were associated with their stress and musculoskeletal relationships. I have a feeling that there is this great reckoning that's about to, or is happening right now, that if you don't adapt to this idea that chiropractic is more than a physiotherapeutic model, that there is going to be a catastrophic wipeout of
Yes.
that group. I think it's going to be, you talk about the most vulnerable coming into to succumbing to the COVID relationship, the comorbidities associated. Let me tell you what a comorbidity in practice is right now. Locking yourself into the belief that what CMCC or what some of the other schools taught you is going to serve you and save you in the
Right.
time of COVID. You're dead.
Right.
You're
Well,
dead.
yeah, I actually, it's a great analogy that I just thought of as I was hearing that. There was a time in Colorado where people had a lot of auto accident coverage for insurance.
Yeah.
Okay. And then and overnight, that changed, and you didn't have as much coverage. I remember people fighting to make sure they still had those privileges, if you want to call it a privilege. And and the year that shifted, and I don't remember the exact number, but I remember the conversation. It's something like 1,000 or 1,500 chiropractic offices in Colorado closed and
Yep.
left the state. Some crazy high number,
I know.
because they could not adapt to that,
Yep.
right? To me, I remember that year because our collections went up, our visits went up, okay, because there were less chiropractors, like their chiropractors left, and people were looking for chiropractors. There were less of them in the state, right? So similar to that right now is that if you've been beating the back pain symptom drum, that has not been enough of a motivation for people to come out of their hole that they've sequestered or quarantined them in to get care, versus now if they're like, oh, this is going to help me be healthy, health is more important than ever for me, I'm prioritizing my chiropractic care, whereas before I wasn't prioritizing it, and I'm going to this office because it's going to help me be at my best. And now I know that health is more than just if I have symptoms or not, but me being at my best, and my nerve system's part of that, that I'm adaptive to this, and it's going to impact my immune system and every aspect of my quality of life. Like it's like chiropractors have gotten a raise rather than that they've had rather than a loss, if they are sharing the chiropractic message that you and I and so many other value.
Well, it's fascinating because again, I'll just dovetail on that whole concept. Is that again, there were places like Colorado and Toronto that got shut down for weeks at a time, and then you take a look at these practices that rebounded. And again, I have a very narrow view of that because I only look at the stats of people that are already drinking my Kool-Aid, or our Kool-Aid, Danny will say, which is this neurofunctional relationship. And the truth of that whole thing is, is that they rebounded to where in literally 4 to 6 weeks of them getting back into the saddle and otherwise, their practices were ahead of where they were in the pre-COVID time. And so I would phone out or speak to them, individually and kind of go, gosh, you're a bit of an anomaly. And they said exactly what you said, in the relationship. They're serving through this uninterrupted principle, and they can't keep the new patients away because there's more people interested in maintaining health instead of fixing back problems. And they're the ones who are, they've got the message and the tools to do it. So
Right.
it's reality.
Right, right. And that's a very good thing to actually shift the focus on, because you mentioned CMCC, and obviously they're not the only chiropractic institution that teaches a joint dysfunction model and a physical
No.
therapeutics model by any means. Sadly, it's the majority of the chiropractic educational process these days. So can you speak to the subluxation being a neural event as compared to a joint dysfunction?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that if we really go back, I'm a graduate of CMCC, and one of the things that they taught us was the very simple Kapanji model that was in the earliest of days. The father of biomechanics, right? Kapanji. And just so you know, when I graduated, there was a pulse there as far as chiropractic went. So there was this sense of trying to tie it in. But if we do take a look at the three subsystems that associate with the spine, we have to look at this active, passive, and control mechanisms. And when we take a look at the active mechanisms, which is muscular, and the passive systems, which are bony structure, neither of those function independently unless there's a controlling mechanism, which is neurology. So for a muscle to fire and a bone to be shifted at a joint level, there has to be an impetus of a reflex arc to get that muscle to bone to muscle to bone to nerve and everything. And what happens is that there is this perpetual, this is why chiropractic is not phrenology or something like that, or even reflexology. It's a science of structure and function as it relates to adaptability and neurology. That's the joy of this, is that when you choose chiropractic, unlike physiotherapy or unlike reflexology or acupuncture, there's a rational intersection between structure, function, neurology, and otherwise. And when you go ahead and recognize that the control before active and passive systems get involved is always neurology. But here's the game, is that you go say, well, like even in biomechanics, Kapanji them would say, yes, but it's all in this circle, and it's not. Because the moment that you engage the central neurology instead of the peripheral neurology, and you start to see that it's not from the IVF outward, but from the IVF inward, and you start to realize that dyskinesia that might be associated and measurable at the very local level is always associated with disafferentation, meaning that there is a brain-based functionality, the brain in the loop, regardless of whether it's a fast-acting spinal reflex, is always being triggered through the limbic system, through the amygdala, and through everything else of where they're emotionalizing the relationship they have with their environment. And so if you take a look at Fred Barge's work in the earliest of days, and Fred was a genius at so many different levels, but he had no problem writing a textbook on scoliosis and being the chiropractor's chiropractor when it came to adjusting to the tone of the nervous system and to everything that associated with the mental impulse. Right. But he said it best when he said this. He said, he took BJ's, one cause, one cure, one correction, right? One cause, one cure, one correction. And he said it very simply is the cause of all changes of state, I'm sick paraphrasing in there, is the inability to interpret ourselves in our environment. Right. In other words, we have a discord of adaptability if we can't perceive ourselves in our environment. And the correction isn't to remove isn't to boost that. It's to remove the interference to our ability to perceive ourselves in our environment. Right. That's neurology. That is neurology. And then right. once you engage neurology, Danny, then the next thing that's so simple to say is neurology is associated with neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity means that we have a plastic nervous system that was designed to adapt, which was designed to memorize. And what I would say, and I've said this sort of, in our conversations, but also from the stage, I said, on average, the on average 160-pound person has somewhere about 36 billion cells, in your body, something like that.
Mhm.
I don't know, it's billion or trillion. Who cares? It's a lot.
Yeah,
And
and then that goes back to our foundational principles that and outcome assessments and the HRV and all of these assessments, which is that we want to see the outcome that the organizational capacity of the nerve system has up leveled from where it is to where the gap between where it is and where it could be. And that happens when there's coherence as compared to interference.
And just finishing that sort of modeling that I was doing about the 30, you were designed through evolutionary processes to have 36 billion trillion success stories inside of you. You have the memorization of adaptability built into your genome. You don't exist today unless your genome has been able to adapt and imprint itself so that you are the best neural image of humanity sitting in front of you right now. You were absolutely fine-tuned
Mm-hmm.
to coexist with your environment, to perceive your environment, and excel in your environment because of your genomic history, which is a neural image as to how the body and evolution has occurred. So don't fight it. Don't worry about outside in as your first priority. Worry about the fact, am I expressing, don't we always say this? My potential. Am
Right.
I expressing, but move it down to the genome. Am I expressing my genomic potential? And the answer is, well, not if you're not writing out your life through your neurology. If you can't write your life out through your own neurology, then you're not taking advantage of your genomic potential.
Right, right. And this is why chiropractors in the world experience that we're living in right now are perfectly positioned to help people have a different focus in their health and well-being and actually deliver on that. And as we've always been able to, but for people to have a different uptake around it and for that message to be heard in a different light, if you actually have outcome assessments that
Yeah.
can show that you're actually delivering that, which do exist in the chiropractic profession, obviously. Let me ask you this, as to wrap this up. What is what two-part question? One is, how do people find out more about using an insight unit? And part two, what's next for CLA and the insight?
Well, they need to call you and sit in your office so they see it in action. No, honestly, we have a very interactive website as well as introductory models where there's some case studies that are sitting there. And so if they just go to Insight CLA, so it's the insightcla.com, and then put a slash and put PSA, that takes them. PSA stands for Practice Survey Assessment. If they go on it to go to that point, it's a very nicely organized entry point into, you can, if you choose to, give us some of the data that sits in your practice, and we can sit down and try and determine what your best strategies are. But there's some great information about what instrumentation, chiropractic, and the rest of it looks like. The website is full of just information down in the blogs and down into the everything on chiropractic, and how you can interact with it all. What's next for CLA? One of the things that we've done is that we've fallen in love with this idea of being a driver and mover of the excellence, not only within chiropractic, but within humanity. And I know that that's a bit bold, but why not? We wake up every day and try and be bolder, right? I want chiropractors to have a new level of confidence when it comes to delivering and their ability to stand in front of people like you do, like I do, like so many of your and my contemporaries and colleagues. We don't fight the principle, we embrace the principle. And the principle was pure And in the lexicon of 2021, we have this ability to bring today's technologies and never divert from the healing potential and healing practices that brought us to where we are in 2021. So my goal with CLA is to literally standardize, and you can take this to the bank, if you will, is literally standardize the relationship that we have in an examination, re-examination, and reporting capacity, so that chiropractors, in the same way they embraced the relationship with X-ray, get a chance to look at today's instrumentation interfaces and embrace that just as much, because it's built on power, and I mean this in the most beautiful way, power is going to shift humankind's perception that they were built genomically to exceed, and we can support them in that belief and output. I believe that, and I know that.
And I agree. So there you go. Wow, this was a chock full of information conversation from outcome assessments to scanning the nerve system to COVID responses to the nerve, nerve system responses to COVID, and also joint dysfunction versus a neural event, and so much more. So I will tell you, if you enjoyed this, it's really just a taste of what you all hear in everything at the Mile High event in September, because it's all going to be about the art from different perspectives, which I'm so thrilled that we're doing this. We've never done that before as a focus. I think it's going to be a very unique experience in chiropractic. Top level, a lot of people's artistry, which I think at this point in the world right now, we have to up our game. The world needs us. Our patients and our communities need us to be able to deliver the goods. And something like scanning the nerve system is a key thing to be able to do that at a higher level.
Oh, listen, I'll be excited, I'll be excited as a presenter to share what I know. But I have to tell you, as an attendee at Mile High, I can't wait to dig into the workshops and to the sessions that are going to be about the art that I'm not a pro at. I think I am, but I want to work with masters.
Right.
I want to hang out with people that know. And if my lens has been on instrumentation, I know that, let's say yourself or Rochelle, that you have put your lens on how to care for people differently than I do. I want to learn from you. I can't wait to be part of that.
And I think that's going to be so fun. Same thing. I'm excited to hear. I haven't, for example, sat in on someone presenting about Gonstead, and who knows how. And I'm like super excited about that. So I think this is going to be a great period of growth for everybody that's there. So, and we're so thrilled to have you help people understand the value of the assessment for whatever approach they're using, in terms of their other analysis protocol and technique focus. So we look forward to seeing you on higher ground, Dr. David Fletcher, at the Mile High altitude and out of Canada for a little bit there. And we look forward to seeing everybody else on Mile High altitude. Remember, if you have not reserved your seats, milehighchiroregistration.com is where you can find all the information. And of course, subscribe to the Mile High podcast so you never miss any Mile High tick. Thank you so much for all you're doing for chiropractic, Dr. Fletcher, and helping people change spines and lives and minds with chiropractic. We so appreciate you.
Love being invited to work with you at any time, Danny, and being a chiropractor is the coolest thing on the planet. So just embrace it.
It is. It's a pretty darn good gig. So, so we look forward to seeing everybody on higher ground in September 24th. We look forward to seeing you there, and keep changing spines and lives and minds with chiropractic.